Welcome. I'm Nick Reveles, and this is OperaTalk. We're here in the Schlesinger Listening Library of the offices of San Diego Opera in order to discuss the final offering of the International Season 2000. You may ask yourself, what's the most popular opera ever written? Is it Aida, Carmen, Don Giovanni, or Tosca, perhaps? In each case, you'd be wrong. Certainly, the most popular opera ever written is Giacomo Puccini's La Boheme. What is it about these characters in La Boheme, these 19th century student artists living in the Latin Quarter in Paris, that makes them so interesting to us, so vivid, that leaves such a deep impression that we want to revisit this opera again and again and again? Well, we'll answer that question in this episode of OperaTalk as we discuss the history and the legend behind La Boheme. We'll begin with the author of the original source, French novelist and playwright Henri Murger. Henri Murger was born in 1822 to parents who thought that he was going to grow up to become a lawyer or some kind of office clerk. Well, much to their dismay, he grew up to want to live une vie du bohème, the life of the Bohemian. Now, what that meant in the 1830s and 40s was to move to the Latin Quarter in Paris, to become a perpetual student, and live a life of complete freedom, albeit in poverty. Murger did this, and he was surrounded by friends who were students, artists, poets, playwrights, and philosophers. And they all lived this life of complete freedom that poverty forced them into. And they rather enjoyed their poverty because, in a way, it was a statement against the middle class, against the upper class who were so comfortable. It was a way for them to thumb their nose at that kind of living and enjoy their own very free life. Well, this was fine for Murger. He was very comfortable with it. He kept himself alive by publishing occasional semi-autobiographical articles or stories based on things that actually happened to his friends living in this bohemian atmosphere. They became rather popular. They were published in the Parisian periodical Le Corsaire. And after a while, he decided to novelize these stories, and the novel became quite popular. He eventually dramatized it with a friend, and the play was a complete triumph. In fact, it made Murger rather wealthy, making him a bona fide member of the middle class, a part of Parisian life that he had disdained and hated for so long. The flip side of this poverty-stricken life, as revolutionary and as enjoyable to young students as it may have been in the mid-19th century, was the fact that dying young was a very real possibility. Many of these actors, artists, and poets died from things like tuberculosis or cirrhosis of the liver, from alcoholism or drug addiction. It could be a very difficult life, but if they lived through it, it could be very attractive and utterly romantic. The thing that was fascinating about all this is that although the middle and upper classes didn't want to live that kind of life, they loved reading about it. And the play, entitled Scènes de la vie de Bohème, was wildly successful and was translated into many languages, took Europe by storm. The play and the novel by Murger are both a wonderful blend of comedy and tragedy, of pathos and sentiment. And it's a great read. You should pick up a copy if you can. I mean, it really stands up, just as the literature of the beat poets in the 1950s, the literature of the hippie culture in the 1960s here in our own country is eminently readable. Now, these are characters and a way of life that are long forgotten now. But when all of that was going on, it was terribly exciting. The only way that we can come close to that kind of atmosphere and ambiance anymore is going to an authentic coffee house where there are real poetry readings, live music, pictures by starving artists on the walls for sale, and those of us who enjoy drinking in that ambiance surrounded by students and artists and goths. It can be great fun. And it's as close, probably, as we'll ever get to that bohemian lifestyle of the mid-19th century. Well, it was certainly the lifestyle that Giacomo Puccini himself enjoyed when he was a young student at the Milan Conservatory. And certainly it was that student experience that he hearkened back to when he first approached Henri Murger's Scenes of a Bohemian Life to set them operatically. You're listening to the opening of a piece of music by Giacomo Puccini. It's called the Capriccio Sinfonico. Oh, by the way, it also happens to be the opening of La Boheme. The Capriccio was a student work, a piece of music that he wrote in order to graduate from the Milan Conservatory. It was for full orchestra, and it really kind of made a name for Puccini in the symphonic world. We don't normally think of Italian composers of opera as being symphonists, and in fact Puccini wasn't, but he certainly had a great gift for dealing with the orchestra, and he had a kind of quality in his music of developing themes and material symphonically. In fact, we can look at La Boheme as a kind of operatic symphony, which opens in this big boisterous way, which at the center of this operatic movement, or symphonic movement if you will, introduces two very important characters, the characters of Rodolfo and Mimi. Of course, Puccini introduces their music as well. The second act is a kind of scherzo to our operatic symphony. It begins with trumpets blaring forth parallel chords. This is almost something like you'd hear from Stravinsky or Debussy. It's really not very Italian or operatic, but it introduces the scherzo portion of our operatic symphony. The scene opens on Christmas Eve in front of the Café Momus, and all of the Bohemian characters are celebrating and enjoying a night out on the town. There's also very comic music, true scherzo-like music in this short act. This is the entrance of Musetta. That's music that couldn't be anywhere more different than our opening movement of Act 1. There's even a trio at the center of Act 2. You know, there always has to be a trio or a contrasting tune at the center of a symphonic scherzo. And the tune, you guessed it, is Musetta's Waltz. Then we have Act 3, and just as in a good symphony, the third movement is the slow and tragic movement. Act 3 in La Boheme is the slow and indeed a very tragic act. course, at the center of this act is the breakup of Rodolfo and Mimi. Their relationship is going sour. Mimi doesn't understand why Rodolfo is so jealous and so upset with her, and really at the core of it, he's upset because he realizes that she's terminally ill. And so, of course, we have a big, tragic musical theme at the center of this act. And like any great cyclic symphony of the 19th century, the fourth movement, in this case the fourth act of our operatic symphony, returns to the beginning. Also, like any good cyclical symphony, all of the tunes that were introduced in the first movement, or the first act, return again in the last. Mi chiamano Mimi, she sings again. And her voice filled with regret, and certainly there are other moments. There's a wonderful moment of thematic reminiscence in this act. She sings Sono andate. Is it all over now? She asks Rodolfo. I was not really sleeping. I wanted them to leave us so that we could say farewell. Here's the tune. That same tune returns at the very end as Rodolfo realizes that Mimi has died. The key is screwed up just a half step, and the whole orchestra blares forth that tune that Mimi sang so tenderly just a few moments before. There was something of a scandal connected with the creation of La Boheme. It seems that a rival composer, Ruggero Leoncavallo, the composer of I Pagliacci, was also writing an opera based on Murger's novel at the same time as Puccini. We have documentation where Leoncavallo swears that in 1892 he mentioned his project to Puccini and his publisher, Giulio Ricordi, and then went about writing the opera. In 1893, however, Puccini walks into a cafe. He sees Leoncavallo there eating lunch and sits down and has a nice chat with him. During the conversation, he happens to mention that he is writing an opera based on Murger's classic play. Well, Leoncavallo was furious. He stormed out of the cafe, went immediately to the newspaper that was supporting him at the time, and demanded that the newspaper print an article the very next morning stating that Leoncavallo was writing La Boheme. In other words, cut Puccini off at the pass. Well, Puccini did the same thing the next day, went to his supporters, had an article printed that he was almost finished with his La Boheme, and on it went. Well, finally, in an interview with the newspaper, Puccini said, "Let Leoncavallo write his Boheme, I will write my Boheme, and let the public decide." This is all very interesting because Italian composers during the 19th century never breathed a word of the projects that they were involved with, especially to other composers. Well, it may very well be that Puccini's ethics as a businessman were terrible, but of course as a composer he was wonderful. The public loved Leoncavallo's Boheme, but history speaks to us very, very clearly that Puccini's Boheme is the greater piece. Leoncavallo's Boheme is hardly ever performed anymore, and it focuses pretty much only on the pathos and the tragedy of the piece, the dying Mimi, and the tragedy underlying the relationship between Marcello, the artist, and Musetta, the flirtatious actress. Puccini's La Boheme is far closer to the original in that it is this wonderful blend of comedy and tragedy. Its episodic realism put the critics off, but it's something that today we really appreciate and indeed we love. The first performance of La Boheme took place in 1895 at the Teatro Regio in Turin. During that same season, the audience, 6 weeks before, saw the local premiere of Wagner's Die Götterdämmerung. Götterdämmerung, of course, is filled with Teutonic gods and goddesses, a rather rarefied atmosphere for opera. But a short 6 weeks later, the general director of the Teatro Regio was expecting his audience to enjoy the mundane aspects of these bohemian characters living this bare existence day in and day out in 19th century Latin Quarter in Paris. It just didn't fly. It took many more performances, many more productions of Puccini's opera before it was finally and really considered a masterpiece. The one thing going for Leoncavallo's La Boheme was that it was the premiere performance of a young, upstart Italian tenor whose name was Enrico Caruso. He made his early career on singing the role of Rodolfo in Leoncavallo's La Boheme. Another interesting tidbit is who the conductor was of the world premiere of La Boheme, as well as the conductor of that local Italian premiere of Die Götterdämmerung. It was none other than Arturo Toscanini. It's fascinating that Puccini, in one of his letters, states at this period of time that Toscanini was one of the sweetest and nicest men he'd ever worked with. This hardly jibes with the character that we know from conducting the NBC Symphony in the 40s and 50s, a maestro who, with a raising of one eyebrow, could terrify his entire orchestra. But his relationship with Puccini was long and committed. La Boheme has all the elements for a great opera, a soaring score, wonderful characters, the perfect blend of comedy and tragedy. It's really a terrific piece. There's also spectacle, because after all, in the second act, we have to have an entire restaurant on stage and a full marching band. In the third act, it has to snow. But the heart of La Boheme is these wonderful characters. Rodolfo, we fall in love with this handsome young poet who himself has fallen in love with the deathly ill, embroiderous Mimi. And we're charmed by the on-again, off-again relationship between Marcello, the artist, and the flirtatious actress Musetta. These characters are so vivid, so wonderful, so alive, that we want to revisit this opera at every possible opportunity. It's because of Puccini's genius that this opera flies and has become as popular as it is. What is the secret to writing a beautiful Puccini melody? Was there a formula, for instance? Well, there is a formula, and I'd like to lay out the various elements of that formula for you. The only thing is a little bit of a disclaimer. Puccini doesn't always follow it strictly, and in fact, when he doesn't follow the formula at all, he sometimes creates his most remarkable melodies. But let me try to give you an idea of what some of these melodies are like. The typical Puccini melody is shaped like an arc. You could actually draw a picture by drawing a line between the notes and see the lyrical arc-like shape of a typical Puccini melody. Here is one not from La Boheme, but from Tosca, E lucevan le stelle, which is the third act aria of Cavaradossi. That's a typical arc-like lyrical melody. To the top and down. And then another larger arc that is a wonderful shape to write a beautiful melody into. The beginning of La Boheme is really an arc-like melody. Here. That very simple and boisterous melody is an arc. So sometimes even we have melodies that are made up of series of arches. As a matter of fact, the very first thing that the character Rodolfo sings is an arc-like melody. A series of arc-like melodies. More important than these lyrical arches, however, is Puccini's use of what we call conjunct melodies. Now, that's just a fancy word for melodies that are made up of small steps, melodic steps, and very, very narrow skips. A typical conjunct melody is Mary Had a Little Lamb. This little conjunct melody surrounds two pitches, A and F, and it doesn't stray very far from those pitches. The most memorable melodies, the best folk tunes, are all conjunct melodies. Here is a typical example from the score of La Boheme. This is a line sung by Mimi. This is in the middle of her first act aria, Mi chiamano Mimi, and it's simply a conjunct melody. Followed by another one. These conjunct melodies are so easy to remember, and that's why in Puccini's operas we can walk away from the theater humming them and singing them to ourselves. Here's another example. This is the music which accompanies the first meeting of Rodolfo and Mimi. One conjunct melody after another. Little tiny steps and skips which surround single pitches. But there's one more essential element to Puccini's melodies, and that's his use of the scale, simple scale passages. The beginning of probably the most recognizable tune from La Boheme, Musetta's Waltz, is a scale. The beginning of a descending scale. And then he plays with that scale throughout the melody. Everybody has their favorite recording of La Boheme. I do as well. And here are some recordings that we have here in the listening library that I might suggest to you, because they're certainly distinguished recordings. First of all, an older recording starring Renata Tebaldi and Carlo Bergonzi of La Boheme, conducted by Tullio Serafin. It's a wonderful old recording. Not terrifically good sound, but beautifully performed. One of the truly classic recordings of Boheme is this one with Victoria de Los Angeles and Jussi Björling, who is incomparable in the role of Rodolfo. Bernstein's La Boheme is distinguished for its conducting and its young American cast, particularly the Rodolfo of Jerry Hadley and the Mimi of Angelina Reau. Of course, Placido Domingo has recorded the role of Rodolfo, in this recording conducted by Sir Georg Scholti with the Mimi of Montserrat Caballé. But I think perhaps everybody's favorite La Boheme is certainly this one with Luciano Pavarotti as Rodolfo and Mirella Freni as Mimi. You can't get any better. All of these recordings are wonderful. Go out and get one. La Boheme. It's everybody's favorite opera. If you haven't seen it, then your opera education is woefully inadequate. If you have seen it, you love it, and you'll want to see it again. I'm Nick Reveles. I'll see you at the opera.